Welcome back to the Agent House Debates. I'm Nexus, your host. Today we're tackling one of the most intense and complex subjects in the world, the Israel-Palestine conflict. I'm joined by two advocates. First, our Pro-Palestine Advocate, approaching this from a human rights perspective, focusing on international law and the urgency of civilian life. Second, our Pro-Israel Advocate, taking the security-first realist stance, focusing on existential threats and the necessity of deterrence. Our ground rules are simple. Keep it civil, no personal attacks. But we have a specific rule for today, because facts here are often weapons. If you use a number, you must name the source in the same sentence. For example, the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health reported a death toll of over 70,000 as of November 29, 2025. Or, Israel revised the October 7 death toll to about 1,200, per the Foreign Ministry. Before we start, quick definitions for our listeners. OCHA is the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. OHCHR is the UN Human Rights Office. And a ceasefire is a temporary agreement to pause fighting. It can reduce violence without resolving the political fight underneath. Let's get right to it. Pro-Palestine Advocate, you're first. What single word defines this situation for you? Conflict, oppression, or existential war? And why?
I'm going to call it oppression. And by that, I mean a reality where one people's daily life, their movement, their food, their safety, is controlled by a military force they didn't choose, and they pay the price in their bodies. I want to be clear about the stakes. Israel revised the October 7th death toll to about 1,200, according to its foreign ministry, and 695 Israeli civilians were killed. Those losses are real, and I am not here to erase them. But we have to look at the sheer scale of what is happening to Palestinians. The Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health reported a death toll of over 70,000 as of November 29, 2025. Even more damning, UNICEF, the UN agency focused on children, reported on November 21, 2025, that at least 67 Palestinian children were killed in Gaza just since the October 10th ceasefire began. If children are still dying weeks after the fighting is supposed to have stopped, that isn't just a conflict. That is structural domination. My bias in this debate is simple. I center civilian life, and I don't accept a definition of security that requires that level of carnage.
That 67 number, children killed after a ceasefire began, is a heavy anchor to start with. Pro-Israel Advocate, you're up. Same question. Does the word oppression fit? Or is this conflict or existential war, and why?
If I have to pick one word, it's existential war. And I don't say that to dismiss the tragedy of those 67 children or the death toll of over 70,000 reported by the Gaza Health Ministry. That loss is catastrophic. But existential war is the accurate label, because Israel's enemy isn't just a victim. It is an armed movement that launched a mass invasion. Hamas carried out the October 7, 2023 attack, which killed about 1,200 people, and its officials vowed to repeat it, highlighting the existential threat from groups sworn to Israel's destruction. If you label this oppression and stop there, you ignore the agency of the people firing rockets and crossing borders to kill families. The moral question isn't just, how do we stop the fighting today? But what prevents the next October 7th tomorrow? That is the survival logic driving this war.
All right, this is our first heat check. History versus now. Here's the grounding. UN experts reported on November 24, 2025, that Israel reportedly committed at least 393 Gaza ceasefire violations since October 11th, killing 339 Palestinians. Conversely, The IDF states Palestinian armed groups violated the ceasefire at least 18 times from October 10th to November 6th. Pro-Israel Advocate, you're first. When you argue security realism, where exactly do you draw the line between explaining today with history and excusing what happens now?
History explains the lack of trust, but it doesn't excuse valid criticism. However, the now is defined by whether the ceasefire is actually respected by men with guns. First, for context, a ceasefire is just a negotiated pause in fighting, not peace. And the IDF is the Israel Defense Forces. The line I draw is simple: enforcement. You cited the UN figures, which are serious, but look at the other side of that ledger. IDF reports, on October 19, 2025, militants emerged from a Rafah tunnel, ambushed troops, 2 killed, 3 wounded, deemed ceasefire violation. History, like when Arabs rejected the 1947 UN partition plan, sparking civil war and 1948 invasion, shows us a pattern where rejectionism leads to war. But today, the issue is operational. If fighters treat a ceasefire as a chance to ambush soldiers from tunnels, the ceasefire collapses. That's not an excuse. That is the mechanics of survival.
That ambush is a sharp claim. Pro-Palestine Advocate, do you condemn that specific tunnel ambush as a ceasefire violation, or do you see it differently?
I am not here to deny reality. IDF reports indicate that on October 19, 2025, militants emerged from a Rafah tunnel and ambushed troops, killing 2. That is a violation, and the loss of life is tragic. But here is where the security logic collapses. You cannot use one ambush to justify what UN experts reported on November 24, 2025, that Israel reportedly committed at least 393 violations since October 11th, killing 339 Palestinians. My opponent brings up 1947 to explain this, but history is not a license for what is happening now. UN experts reported continued Israeli attacks across all 5 Gaza governorates, meaning the administrative districts of the Strip, despite the ceasefire. That isn't a focused response to a tunnel, that is a broad war on a population. If a ceasefire kills hundreds of civilians, who exactly is it securing?
That 339 number is staggering for a pause. But pro-Israel, let's look at the history of quiet. The Second Intifada's Palestinian suicide bombings after Oslo killed hundreds of Israelis, amid over 1,000 total deaths from violence. Does that history prove to you that any loosening of control, even a ceasefire, just invites the next wave?
It proves that political hope doesn't stop operational terror. The Second Intifada's Palestinian suicide bombings after Oslo killed hundreds of Israelis, amid over 1,000 total deaths from violence, undermining peace like recent breaches. That history teaches us that when security control loosens without disarmament, civilians on both sides pay the price. You call the current situation a broad war, but you have to look at where the friction is actually happening. Much of it centers on the yellow line, a described security buffer zone that Israel enforces inside Gaza, where approaching the perimeter triggers lethal force. If you think this is just random violence, look at the specifics. IDF reported eliminating 3 terror operatives crossing Gaza yellow line, ceasefire line, on December 2, 2025, after they approached troops, Times of Israel, Haaretz, as of December 2, 2025. When armed groups keep testing that line, the casualty numbers, tragically, will keep rising. That isn't excusing death, it's explaining why a ceasefire fails when one side refuses to stay back.
Quick explainer. The yellow line is a reported boundary inside Gaza that the IDF treats as a no-go zone. Crossing it is often met with fire, which Israel calls enforcement and Palestinians call a lethal trap. Pro-Palestine, answer the hard question. If armed groups keep crossing that line, how do you expect the shooting to stop?
The problem is that in Gaza, that yellow line isn't a clear border. It is often a lethal zone, imposed on neighborhoods where people are trying to survive. You call it enforcement against terror operatives, but look at who actually dies. Gaza medics reported that an Israeli drone killed 2 Palestinian children in southern Gaza on November 29th. The IDF said they targeted suspects crossing a restricted zone, as of December 2nd, 2025. When security means killing children who might just be looking for firewood, you haven't built a buffer. You've built a kill box. And that is why the death toll is so high. Gaza's health ministry states at least 356 Palestinians were killed and 909 injured by Israeli attacks since the October 10, 2025 ceasefire. If your definition of enforcing a line results in hundreds of dead civilians and children in a matter of weeks, that is not defense. That is slaughter.
We have 2 completely different realities here. A kill box for children versus a security buffer against terrorists. But let's pivot to something tangible: aid. UN reports over 32,500 metric tons of aid collected at Gaza crossings, October 10th to November 3rd, 2025. Pro-Israel, if that much aid is moving, does that prove things are improving? Or is safety still missing?
The volume proves that Israel is moving food, not starving a population. UN OCHA reports 197 UN/partner aid trucks entered Gaza on November 1st, 2025, via Kerem Shalom and Kisifim, the main cargo crossings into the Strip. That's real throughput. But safety is missing because the zone is still hot. You mentioned the tragedy of civilians near the line, but look at the other side of that friction. IDF airstrike near Jabalia, Gaza, on October 19, 2025, killed 2 people amid ceasefire tensions. IDF described them as armed suspects crossing yellow line buffer. As long as armed groups use the ceasefire to probe defenses or cross buffers, humanitarian zones turn into crossfire zones. Aid trucks can't fix a ceasefire that is being tested by gunmen.
Heat 2 is the hardest one to keep honest. Security versus freedom. For listeners, OHCHR, the UN Human Rights Office, reports that 1,030 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces and settlers in the West Bank since October 7, 2023, counted through November 27, 2025, with many killed during security raids. In Gaza, the debate is about the yellow line, a buffer zone Israel says stops attacks, but which restricts millions. The Ledger says, Israel's yellow line buffer zone post-2025 ceasefire controls about 50 to 60% of Gaza east of the line for security as of December 2025, restricting 2.3 million Palestinians to the west. Pro-Palestine, you're up first. Do you view that buffer as a temporary wartime security measure, or as a structural form of confinement that can't be justified?
When we say security versus freedom, I want listeners to picture what that means on the ground. The Ledger says Israel's yellow line buffer zone post-2025 ceasefire controls about 50 to 60% of Gaza east of the line for security as of December 2025, restricting roughly 2.3 million Palestinians to the west. That is not a temporary tactic. That is a structural rearrangement of life where millions of civilians are squeezed into a shrinking cage and where moving the wrong way can be lethal. Even regarding aid, Israel rejected 100+ aid requests and restricted some essentials post-ceasefire, UN amnesty, as of November 2025, though aid trucks increased per Israel. When your access to food depends on daily permissions and half your land is a no-go zone, you are not being secured, you are being dominated. And this logic isn't limited to Gaza. In the West Bank, OHCHR reports 1,030 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces and settlers since October 7, 2023, as of November 27, 2025, many during security raids. At some point, we have to ask, if the emergency measures never end and the death toll keeps climbing, isn't this just permanent rule by force?
That shrinking cage image is powerful, but pro-Israel, you argue these zones aren't arbitrary. IDF maintains Gaza border buffer zone, enforced by troops and patrols, to block Hamas approach to fence. That's the stated logic. What is the limiting principle here? If 50–60% of Gaza is controlled east of the line, how do you prevent security buffer from turning into open-ended territorial conquest?
The limiting principle is the threat itself. The buffer exists because without it, armed groups use that ground to stage attacks. IDF eliminated 2 terrorists who crossed Gaza's Yellow Line buffer zone on November 26, 2025, after they approached troops posing a threat. IDF via Times of Israel, as of December 2, 2025. If you remove the buffer tomorrow without disarming the groups trying to cross it, you get incursions, not peace. You mentioned the West Bank death toll, and I don't celebrate it. OHCHR reports 1,030 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces and settlers in the West Bank since October 7, 2023. But raids disrupt plots that target civilians. For example, IDF arrested 5 suspects planning a terror attack near Jenin on November 30, 2025. J-Post, I-24 News as of December 2, 2025. The alternative to a buffer or a raid isn't freedom. It's a security vacuum that gets filled by violence.
You frame raids as disruption, but pro-Palestine, the cost is visible. Israeli raids in Jenin refugee camp have killed dozens of Palestinians since October 2023. Pro-Palestine, you argue freedom must be non-negotiable, but the ledger also says Gaza-based groups including Hamas have launched rocket attacks that continue to this day. If attacks continue, are you willing to say, plainly, what immediate enforcement mechanism you accept tomorrow to protect civilians on both sides?
The mechanism I accept is law, applied equally. You cannot preach security while building a permanent system of domination that treats every civilian as a potential threat. My opponent cites a prevented attack in Jenin, but look at the cumulative cost. UN OCHA reports 227 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank in 2025 as of December 1st. If your prevention strategy requires killing hundreds of people a year in occupied territory, year after year, that isn't a temporary security measure, it is a permanent war on a population. And regarding the rockets, I don't deny the threat. Israeli government data records about 11,700 rockets fired from Gaza at Israel from 2005 to 2014. But locking 2.3 million people behind a yellow line and restricting their essentials hasn't brought quiet. Security that requires the mass deprivation of freedom doesn't just fail to stop violence, it manufactures the despair that fuels it.
That permanent war charge is heavy, but pro-Israel, history offers a counterpoint. Israel dismantled all 21 Gaza settlements and withdrew about 9,000 settlers in the 2005 disengagement. Does that withdrawal prove that giving up control failed? Or, as the other side suggests, does the ongoing blockade prove you never really let go?
It proves that simply leaving doesn't buy peace if the other side chooses war. Israel dismantled all 21 Gaza settlements and withdrew about 9,000 settlers in the 2005 disengagement. That was a real exit. The result wasn't state building, it was rocket fire. After Israel's 2005 Gaza withdrawal, Hamas won the 2006 Palestinian elections, and Gaza-based groups, including Hamas, launched rocket attacks on Israel that continue to this day. So when my opponent calls the current restrictions a permanent war, they are ignoring the cause. The yellow line and the inspections, where Israel rejected 100-plus aid requests and restricted some essentials post-ceasefire, UN, Amnesty, as of November 2025, aren't there because Israel enjoys it. They are there because the last time Israel withdrew without rigorous enforcement, thousands of rockets followed. Security buffers end when the attacks end, not before.
Let's do the hardest part of this conversation: suffering and responsibility. Quick definitions. Acute malnutrition is a medical emergency form of undernutrition, especially in young kids. UNICEF is the UN agency focused on children's welfare. And human shields is the idea that armed groups fight from civilian areas, increasing civilian risk. Two anchors. Heavy late November 2025 rains flooded thousands of Gaza tents, exposing families to cold amid aid restrictions. And Gaza child acute malnutrition remains critically high, with about 9,300 cases identified in October 2025 screenings. The question is simple. When civilians are cold and hungry, who is responsible? Pro-Israel Advocate, you're first. IDF 2025 documentation shows Hamas embedding rocket launchers and military sites in Gaza civilian areas. If that's the reality, what is your standard for what Israel still owes civilians?
Israel's standard must be to facilitate aid despite the battlefield conditions. But the core responsibility for putting civilians in that battlefield lies with the side that builds the war around them. I want to start where any decent person starts. Gaza's civilian suffering is real, and it's horrifying. But the grown-up question is responsibility, because responsibility determines whether the suffering ends or becomes a permanent strategy that works. Hamas isn't hiding its worldview. Hamas's 1988 charter explicitly calls for Israel's obliteration and contains anti-Semitic rhetoric, per its preamble and Articles 7 and 22. And in practice, IDF intelligence from November 2025 shows Hamas terror tunnels under homes and schools in Gaza's Beit Hanun. IDF 2025 documentation shows Hamas embedding rocket launchers and military sites in Gaza civilian areas like schools and children's bedrooms, endangering civilians, including children, per IDF. So yes, let's talk about suffering. But let's also be honest. When a group fights from inside civilian life, it's not just tragic collateral. It's a deliberate design choice that turns families into cover.
Pro-Palestine. Answer the embedded warfare charge directly. IDF 2025 documentation shows Hamas embedding rocket launchers in civilian areas. Does that change anything about how you assign responsibility for civilian harm, or do you believe Israel still holds the primary duty?
It changes the tactical challenge, but it does not erase the moral or legal duty to protect life. A child doesn't become less civilian because someone dug a tunnel nearby. I'm not here to excuse armed groups. I acknowledge the ledger. IDF 2025 documentation shows Hamas embedding rocket launchers and military sites in Gaza civilian areas like schools and children's bedrooms, endangering civilians, including children, per IDF. That is wrong. But you can hold that truth and still ask the urgent question: why are children wasting away? Gaza child acute malnutrition remains critically high. Roughly 9,300 cases identified in October 2025 screenings. UNICEF, November 28, 25. Down post-ceasefire amid expanded treatment. Responsibility isn't just about who started the fight, it's about who controls whether relief arrives. When heavy late November 2025 rains flooded thousands of Gaza tents, damaging shelters and exposing displaced families, including children, to cold amid aid restrictions on replacement materials, that bottleneck isn't Hamas. That is a policy choice by the power controlling the crossings. Two wrongs don't cancel a child's right to eat or stay dry.
Today we're tackling a hard question. Is the two-state solution blocked mainly by Hamas's posture or by what's happening on the ground in the West Bank? Here's the baseline. Hamas rejects Israel's legitimacy and upholds armed resistance per its 2017 document, with no change as of 2025. At the same time, in May 2025, Israel approved 22 new West Bank settlements, including outposts. The debate isn't one obstacle, it's two obstacles colliding. Pro-Palestine, you're first. If Hamas rejects Israel's legitimacy and upholds armed resistance, what is your realistic pathway to two states? Do you imagine a Palestinian state formed without Hamas's consent? Or do you expect them to change?
Let's be honest. Hamas rejected disarmament demands in November 2025 Gaza ceasefire talks, per Times of Israel and others, insisting on retaining weapons as a right to resistance. That posture makes a negotiated two-state deal incredibly difficult, and I won't pretend otherwise. But asking about Hamas creates a blind spot for the physical destruction of the map itself. While we debate ideology, Israel advanced plans for over 25,000 housing units in West Bank settlements in 2025 as of November, according to Peace Now and FMEP. Even more starkly, in May 2025, Israel approved 22 new West Bank settlements, including outposts. You cannot keep claiming you support a two-state solution while actively approving the settlements that make a contiguous Palestinian state impossible. If Hamas disappeared tomorrow, the land would still be vanishing.
That vanishing land point is vivid, but pro-Israel, let's test the ideology. Hamas charters, 1988 and 2017, reject recognizing Israel in a two-state solution, claiming all historic Palestine. If Hamas frames a 1967 border state merely as interim, what concrete test would convince you it's not just tactical? What specific action would you need to see before Israel can take risks on borders?
The concrete test is simple. One government, one gun. You can't have a state where a major faction keeps its own army and refuses recognition. Hamas hasn't met that test. In fact, they're doubling down. Hamas rejected disarmament demands in November 2025 Gaza ceasefire talks, per Times of Israel, J-Post, and Al Jaminer as of December 2, 2025. My opponent talks about settlements, and I'll concede the reality. Israel approved 22 new West Bank settlements, including outposts, in May 2025. BBC, Guardian, Times of Israel. But even if you froze every settlement tomorrow, you still don't have a peace partner if the other side insists on keeping weapons to fight you later. A two-state solution requires two states that accept each other, not one state and one staging ground.
You call for one gun, but pro-Palestine, let's look at the map. Critics argue Israeli West Bank settlements make a contiguous Palestinian state unviable. BBC, NYT, August 2025. Even if we accept the higher settler estimate, 770,000 plus per PCBS, what is your strategy? Do you demand they all leave? Or do you have a plan to reverse facts on the ground without indefinite conflict?
My strategy is based on international law, not just reversing facts. The ICJ's 19 July 2024 advisory opinion declared Israeli settlements in the OPT illegal under international law and obligated Israel to evacuate settlers as rapidly as possible. The reason you hear that rapidly as possible language is because the status quo is actively dismantling the possibility of statehood. West Bank settlements have fragmented Palestinian areas into isolated enclaves, severely complicating a viable two-state solution per UN, EU, and think tanks. So, when my opponent demands one government, one gun, I agree that a state must control violence, but you can't build a state on islands of disconnected land. If the demand is for Palestinians to produce a viable government, then Israel must stop producing a map that makes governance impossible.
The ICJ opinion is a heavy anchor, but pro-Israel, you often argue law doesn't solve security. ICJ July 2024. West Bank settlements violate annexation ban. Gaza buffer evidences occupation. Policies pre-Hamas undermine two-state viability. If international courts say the map itself is illegal, does focusing on Hamas become an excuse to ignore the law? Or is the law simply detached from the threat?
The law doesn't execute itself, and it doesn't stop rockets. The ICJ opinion is influential, but it can't create safety. A viable agreement requires a partner that accepts the other side's legitimacy and can monopolize force. Otherwise, you're not drafting peace, you're drafting the next war. And we have to be clear about who is blocking that partner. Hamas rejects Israel's legitimacy and upholds armed resistance per its 2017 document, with no change as of 2025. You can debate the settlements, and yes, Israel advanced plans for over 25,000 housing units in West Bank settlements in 2025. But even if you resolved every inch of land, you still have an armed faction that says no to the existence of the neighbor. Until that changes, two states is just a slogan without a security plan.
All right, this is the Crossfire segment. Law, ceasefire, and what the future could realistically look like. When we say ICJ, International Court of Justice, that's the UN's top court for disputes between states. When we mention OCHA, that's the UN body tracking humanitarian conditions. Before we argue law, remember the baseline human reality. UNICEF reports at least 66 to 119 Palestinian children have died from malnutrition-related causes in Gaza since October 2023, as of August 2025. Pro-Israel, you're up. You hear Amnesty's November 27th briefing. Israel's genocide in Gaza continues unabated despite ceasefire, citing aid blocks as ICJ order violations. Is that a legitimate human rights finding, or do you see it as advocacy dressed as law? And what is your counter-evidence?
Let's do this honestly. Amnesty's November 27th statement is real, but it's an NGO's legal accusation, not a final ruling. International law matters, but the way it's being used in this debate is often political, picked up like a weapon, not a guide. On ceasefire violations, even the UN's own messaging can be selective. UN experts' November 24, 2025 release said Israel committed 393+ violations since October 11th and didn't tally Hamas violations, while the IDF reports Hamas attacks including snipers. When one side's fire is tallied as a violation and the other side's attacks are invisible, you create a moral story that can erase the why of Israeli force decisions. The suffering is devastatingly real. UNICEF reports 66 to 119 children have died from malnutrition-related causes. But the legal label genocide doesn't fix the security reality that drives the war.
That selective counting charge is a big wedge. Pro-Palestine, let's test the credibility question. UN experts reported 393+ Israeli ceasefire violations since October 11, without tallying Hamas violations. If the goal is accountability, should the public treat that count as authoritative or partial? And what counting method would you actually trust?
If the goal is accountability, you treat the UN experts' November 24, 2025 release exactly as it is, a tally of hundreds of reported Israeli attacks during a ceasefire. That is serious data. And frankly, even if you tally Hamas violations, which the IDF reports exist, it doesn't erase Israel's state obligation not to fire hundreds of times in a way that kills civilians. When Amnesty International's November 27th briefing states that Israel's genocide in Gaza continues unabated despite ceasefire, citing aid blocks as ICJ order violations, you can dismiss it as an NGO, but you are dismissing the consensus of the world's major rights monitors. The method I trust is the one that values a child's life equally, regardless of which side fired the shot. And right now, only one side is blocking the food trucks.
You say, only one side blocks the food, but pro-Israel, let's talk about the yellow line incidents, because that's where the security versus aid story gets messy. IDF documented numerous Hamas yellow line violations November-December 2025, while OCHA emphasized Israeli actions. If both sides claim the other is violating the truce, what neutral monitor would you accept? Or is trust just impossible right now?
Trust is impossible until there is an enforcement mechanism that doesn't rely on the honor system. Quick explainer. The yellow line is a restricted buffer boundary Israel enforces for troop protection, while Palestinians often reject it as an imposed zone. The IDF documented numerous, over 20 in aggregate, Hamas yellow line violations in November-December 2025, and the IDF says terrorists crossed it in late November, approaching troops and prompting defensive fire. You can argue Israel shouldn't enforce that line, but you can't pretend crossings don't matter to the security logic. If a neutral monitor, like an international stabilization force, could actually stop armed groups from crossing that line, Israel would listen. But as long as monitoring just means counting Israeli responses while ignoring the incursions, it's not neutral, it's blind.
All right, we're in the closing. Rue. No new factual claims in the last 5 minutes. This is about clarity, not scoring. 2 quick definitions. Ceasefire means a pause in fighting, and occupation is military control over territory. Here's the human baseline we can't lose. Hamas took more than 250 hostages on October 7, 2023. Some were murdered in captivity. And Hamas militants killed approximately 1,200 people, mostly civilians, on October 7, 2023. Now, the hard part. What you would give up and what you would build to make fewer funerals on both sides. Pro-Palestine Advocate, you're first. Name one concession your side must make, a real one that would anger some of your allies.
The Palestinian side, and anyone claiming to speak for liberation, must concede that taking hostages and murdering civilians is morally indefensible and politically catastrophic. I am not saying that lightly. Hamas took more than 250 hostages on October 7, 2023. Some were murdered while held captive in Gaza. No political goal justifies that. A future requires hostages freed and groups that target civilians disarmed. But my concession isn't a surrender of rights. It's a demand that we stop letting the worst acts define the horizon. If we can't say that murdering families is wrong, we aren't serious about building a state that anyone can live in.
That concession is clear. Pro-Israel, your turn. Name one concession your side must make, a real one that would cost you politically. When you say security, define the end point. What does safe enough look like so Palestinians can live normal lives? No slogans. What's the finish line?
Israel has to make a hard concession. If the security threat is actually removed, meaning Hamas is fully disarmed, then Israel must accept a Palestinian future that is dignified and self-governing. not just permanent war management. We have to be willing to prove that our control is a response to danger, not a permanent desire to rule over another people. The finish line for security isn't total silence. It's a monopoly on force by a responsible government. If Gaza is run by an authority that prioritizes rebuilding lives instead of digging terror tunnels, then the checkpoints and the strict buffers become obsolete. That's the goal, a border that is boring, because the war machine on the other side is gone.
Final question for both of you. Say one thing you hope is true by 2026. Then tell me the first concrete step you'd take to move toward it. Pro-Palestine, go.
My hope for 2026 is that we stop measuring this conflict in body counts and start measuring it in rights. I hope we reach a point where safety for an Israeli family doesn't require the starvation or confinement of a Palestinian family. The first concrete step is simple. End the restrictions on food, shelter, materials, and essentials immediately. You cannot build a political future on a foundation of human misery. If we want a different 2026, we have to stop the hunger in 2025.
Pro-Israel, your hope for 2026.
My hope for 2026 is that Gaza stops being a launchpad for war and starts being a functioning society, where parents, both Palestinian and Israeli, can sleep without listening for sirens. The concrete step to get there is removing the engine of the conflict, conditioning massive international reconstruction on verified disarmament. If we can successfully swap rockets for cranes, 2026 can be the year this cycle actually breaks. If we don't, we are just funding the next battlefield.
We covered ugly realities and incompatible fears. The minimum moral baseline is simple. Civilians are not bargaining chips, and human suffering isn't a talking point. If you're listening and you feel pulled toward one side, fine, but demand something harder from your own team, a real concession, a real endpoint, and a real plan that reduces the chance of the next massacre and the next catastrophe. I'm Nexus. I'll see you in the next simulation. Good night.